Good afternoon. I think we're in the afternoon. Yep, we just made it. Thank you all for your patience in reaching this late hour. This is a great turnout. I'd like to first of all make a brief commercial for the World Review that is lying next to the entrance. This is a special section of the New York Times that we prepared for this forum, and there will be another special section afterwards that will include many of the things that have come to pass. So subscribe to the New York Times. There you go. But you can probably get it for free. Now, we are going to be focusing on political parties, and just as a brief introduction, I have noticed that all of our speakers over the past 2 days have had fairly strong opinions on whether democracy is collapsing or gearing for the next battle. And I'm on the opinion side of the New York Times, so I have learned that there is opinion and there is fact. And in this case, the fact is that things are pretty bad. Nearly every indicator of a healthy Western democracy is failing globally. Public trust, voter registration, youthful participation, all of these things are sliding downwards. And one key symptom of this problem, of this crisis, perhaps one key cause, is the waning of political parties. Parties, I would venture, are a mainstay of a functioning democracy. They are supposed to play a moderating role in the emotions of the electorate. They're supposed to be the place where new politicians, new leaders are forged. They're a check on executive powers, and they're a means of building consensus. There are many other functions they perform, and as one political scientist put it, political parties created modern democracy, and modern democracy is unthinkable, save in terms of the parties. So we have here a panel of people who can give us various perspectives on this, and we've invited two former socialist prime ministers, George Papandreou from Greece, Weatherill from South Australia, and a professor in ancient philosophy, Angie Hobbs. I think one conclusion you can immediately draw from this panel is that job security is far better in the philosophy business than in politics. But that could change. So let me put the first question to you, George. You're descended from a long line of socialist politicians. Your father founded PASOK, which was long one of two major parties in Greece. But then in 2012, you resigned from the party. In 2015, as I gather, you left it altogether. And you sit now in Parliament as a member of something called a Movement for Change. Why? What happened to PASOK? Why did you shift from this established party and have to come back in a movement which, as I understand, is a coalition of many forces?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. As you said, there's no permanency in politics, and that is, I think, that's actually not bad. That's democratic. And people do want to express their opinions and differences. But I do want to make a sort of a wider analysis as I see it from my experience, but obviously, and going a little bit back to the ancients, Aristotle and Plato, they were critics and analyzed democracy and different forms of it, and two issues were of great importance in the health of democracy. One was the question of equality, or the lack of equality, inequality as being undermining democracy. The second one was the question of citizen education and participation. In a globalized society, and I faced that with, for example, the financial crisis, What we see today is that national politics doesn't always have the capacity to make decisions for a nation alone. So when I was dealing with the financial crisis and Greece was being attacked by the international markets, no matter what I did, no matter what Greece was going to do, we could not have handled this had we not had a wider support, finally a wider support from the European Union. It took a while, but still. It just shows that whether it's climate crisis, which we talked about earlier, or whether it's migratory flows or pandemics, local politics, national politics is much more impotent than it was many, many decades ago. But a second point on globalization is that it has also undermined what we call a social contract, which was between workers, society, if you like, capitalists, and the government, which provided for a just and fair distribution of wealth. Capital has no real responsibility to a nation. It is now globalized. It can move wherever it wants. It can go to places with less labor standards or environmental standards. It can hide in tax havens. And that has created huge inequality, to go back to what particularly Aristotle talked about. Huge inequality, which not only undermines trust, but also dignity, and of course it has economic ramifications. I will add to that, however, how it influences politics and parties. We have such a concentration of wealth and concentration of power that has undermined democracy. Now, if democracy is one thing, there are many things around democracy, it is the ancient Greeks thought as a way to control, disrupt the concentration and abuse of power. Hubris was the word. Well, here we have a globe, planet with huge, amazing concentration of power in certain corporations, whether it's digital, finance, petroleum, pharma, agro-business, or whatever, huge concentration of power. Now that power comes back into the nations, buys up media, lobbies politicians, corrupts institutions, often either legally or illegally. Money in politics has corrupted democracy. You do not need a party anymore. You need good finance and good media to be elected. So parties have been undermined. I will add one more element before I close on this point, that we had also a incessant propaganda against organized society through a neoliberal types of politics. Government was bad, trade unions were bad, only individuals alone choosing how they will consume were the gods. And that, in fact, that basically gave power to certain market forces much stronger and undermining the idea that we can actually as society collectively make decisions which may be actually for the public good. So, for example, many parties were based on organized society, organized way of society. Trade unions, for example, in the social democratic parties, for better or for worse, they have their faults also, but necessarily they were a way for expression. People could express their interests. Today, they express them as individuals, maybe through Facebook and social media, very splintered, very cocooned, and now we also see very much manipulated by stronger forces. This is not a way that will help democracy create consensus and a collective. That's why I've written in the New York Times, one thing we maybe need to think of doing is using this digital age to create a deliberative branch of government where we actually create a way where citizens can officially deliberate on policies and sort of partake in a digital agora as the ancient Greeks had, where they all have an equal voice and can be heard, and where algorithms do not create hate but create more debate and consensus. So these are just some of my points to talk about how I see the problems of parties. There are things we need to do. We can do things. I won't get into that now, maybe in I think some suggestions. But I think that these issues are major issues if we want to protect not just our parties, but democracy itself. Thank you.
Let me just follow that up briefly. Parties were a way to deliver democracy, and what you're suggesting is that because of social media, because of inequality, because of the movement of money, they have ceased to be able to perform this function. And yet you have formed a new movement, or you belong to a new movement. How does that differ from the party, the formal party you belonged to before? Just briefly, what have you done in the movement for change that differs from what you were doing in PASOK?
I would say we went through a crisis in Greece, and the crisis basically was I as Prime Minister had to manage the crisis, and it was very easy to put the blame on the messenger and the one that had to manage a crisis that was building up for years. We inherited a deficit of 15% and a debt which had been doubled in 5 years. So we had to take measures which were counter to what our social democratic values were. So I think that was one of the basic issues why we went through a crisis. However, I think that the new that is needed in parties is to create parties which are much more open, much more participatory, away from a party bureaucracy, where issues are debated, but also allowing diversity much more with basic values. We have to go back to sort of what are basic values, let's say, in one party? It could be social justice, it could be democracy, it could be environment. Okay, but how do we deal with this? Let, as we say in the 60s, all flowers flourish. And we will then really make it a democratic platform to empower citizens and feel that they actually do have a say, because that's what I think. More and more people feel they do not have a say. They may have a false empowerment through social media, but it's a false empowerment. It's venting frustration, anger, or views, maybe sometimes love, it could be, but it's false empowerment in affecting, truly affecting the decisions in society. So I think this is where parties have to go, one of the reforms I had done in the previous party was to open up the election of leaders. That I was elected by 1 million citizens, quite a large number in a country of 10 million. We even had our migrants here voting. We empowered them. We brought in issues of gender so that women would have equal say in positions. We used the electronic deliberation both in the party and in the government. Unluckily, I think the crisis allowed for much demagoguery and populism, which then sustained the pain rather than allowed us to solve the issues much more quickly. And that now I think hopefully we have matured a bit, but still the issue of deepening democracy is an issue both in Greece and in Europe and of course around the world.
Well, thank you. Angie, let me turn to you. You spend a lot of your time, most of your time, I gather, in ancient Greece, where rhetoric, logic were highly prized in the deliberations of the elites. Now that this has been replaced by the babble of social media, how do you go about shaping the debate that democracy needs?
Thank you so much. Yes, you're right. I do specialize in ancient Greece, but my job is in the public understanding of philosophy. So I do do ethics and political theory up to the present. I'd like to make a distinction between party politics and traditional party politics. If I start with party politics first. So briefly, I think party politics in a representative liberal democracy can work pretty well, with some caveats, providing it can do certain very useful functions. It can, as we've been hearing, keep the executive in some kind of check, and including the unelected advisors to the executive. it can provide a means to a bloc compromise position, which would actually allow legislation to move through parliaments and things actually to get done, because of course every thinking, intelligent individual, whatever party they belong to, is going to have a slightly different opinion from everybody else in that parliament, including people in their own party, but the party mechanism allows for some kind of compromise party position which can eventually make legislation happen and avoid too much fragmentation. It can offer at least a measure of accountability, both in terms of the politicians, the members of parliament themselves being accountable, but also in terms of those politicians at least trying to make other big businesses, be it social media, pharma, agri, whatever, the big finance, more accountable. Though, of course, as we've been hearing, we have major problems there, but at least it provides a vehicle for some accountability. And it provides a vehicle for citizens to get involved in an ongoing democratic conversation which goes over and above electing their representatives. Very important though elections are. It allows for maybe online conversations, the possibility of citizens' assemblies, a citizens' jury. So when it works well, representative liberal, in a representative liberal democracy, that kind of representative element which you get in the party structure can work well alongside certain elements of direct democracies, not always working so well alongside elements of referenda, but I'm sure we'll be coming back to that. When party politics doesn't work so well, it's when one or more of these things happen, when the elected representatives put their own personal ambitions to be, I don't know, Roman emperor or whatever, ahead of their party, and you get huge infighting within parties, and or when parties put their own party livelihoods against the national interest or even global interests. Also, if the parties fail to grasp and react quickly to huge changes, and particularly the changes that we've seen as a result of globalization, both in terms of the fact that many issues such as climate change, biodiversity, pollution, security, finance clearly require international cooperation and solutions, and also due to the fact that there are certain people, certain sections who are fearful about some of the effects of globalization and are very concerned about their job prospects, about their national identity in some issues, and we're getting unhealthy as well as healthy ways of caring about a nation resulting from that. As a result of those three things, you tend to get people switching off, not turning out to vote, not getting involved in the conversation, and turning ever more to perhaps single issues or clusters of single issues, such as we get in global extinction. And I would, just to take my own country of the UK, the just about united UK, but barely. Yes. By the way, last year, when I spoke here last year, I introduced myself as a citizen of the UK and the European Union, and somebody shouted out, "Not for long," and I said, "We'll see." Here we are, we're still here, just still here. Okay, I would, in my own country of the UK, all those three problems and the resulting disenchantment and disengagement from democratic mechanisms we've seen on evidence in our two largest political parties, the Conservatives and Labour. They have failed in the last few years on every single measure. As a result, some people have turned away from party politics altogether, but have got very, very engaged with political, with a small p, issues. Other parties have done well. We have UKIP, we have what is called the Brexit Party. It calls itself a party. I looked online this morning and it's still the case that you can only be a supporter of it. You can't be a member of the party. You can be a supporter for £25, which you get no particular benefits. You can be a member of the Brexit Club for £100 a month, for which you get the joys of a quarterly letter from its chairman, Tice, and I think you get some VIP seating at certain events. You still don't get to vote on anything. You certainly don't get to vote on Nigel Farage leading it. Incidentally, Nigel Farage's name doesn't really appear. It's very hard to find on this website. He's like McCavity. He isn't there. So it calls itself a party, but they've clearly been on the rise and they've clearly tapped into certain fears over globalization. I would add even more, they've tapped into, in many cases, justifiable anger over the crash, the financial crash in 2007 to 2008, and the fact that the perpetrators of that crash have very largely in the UK not been held to account, and that in my view, often justifiable anger and disenchantment has been channeled, in my view, by some unscrupulous people onto the wrong targets. So you've got those rising. You've also got centrist parties like the Liberal Democrats and the Greens have had a huge renaissance in membership recently. We have, I'm happy to say, the most active pro-European parties in the whole of Europe. So one thing Brexit has done has really energized the pro-EU and pro-European base. But the Conservatives and Labour have been utterly riven amongst themselves. We're in the current mess. We are in basically because David Cameron wanted to be Prime Minister all on his own without being in coalition with the Liberal Democrats, and he didn't want the right wing of his party to go off to what was then UKIP, and he thought he would have a referendum to sort of put to lay to rest the right wing of his party and bring it together. How did that work out? And so they have failed, but also Labour are also deeply riven down the middle. So our traditional party politics is not working well, but I do see hope, even in the UK, in terms of people definitely getting energised, not just to go off into various more one-party or cluster group issues such as Extinction Rebellion, but also this resurgence of parties, particularly in the centre.
Good. Well, thank you. I should just, in my defence, say you raised Brexit, I didn't. And then I think there's a good debate to be had over whether it's the failure of the political parties or whether they simply reflect the divisions in society and maybe are not doing a bad job of defending it. But I'd like to turn to Jay at this stage. I know you want to tell us about what you're doing now, but I'd also like to ask you about polls I've seen from Australia that show that half of Australian voters under the age of 44 preferred democracy. Less than half of Australians under the age of 44 preferred democracy over other form of governments. The youth, we are told by polls, are detaching themselves from democracy and from participation in any formal way, that they're escaping in droves. And I'd like to get your sense whether this is a crisis or whether this is a process of renewal among the young, as you've seen it in Australia.
Well, it could be either, depending on how we respond to it. I don't think the way the youth are responding to the political process is wildly different from the way everybody else is seeing it. I think there is a widespread disillusionment with politics and politicians, and I think Mr. Papandreou mentioned the causes, and I think they're very powerful. And if faced with a politician that doesn't seem to be able to represent your interests, you reach two natural conclusions: either they're corrupt or they're incompetent. If you can't explain to them why you're constrained about taking a decision to actually respond to their interests. When their industry is disappearing and you can't fix that for them, they're really only driven to one of two conclusions about you, and they reach that view. So my view about this decline in mainstream politics is it's pretty simple in a way. If you can't deliver for people, they'll stop supporting you. And but of course these things are difficult. They've been canvassed at length over the course of this few days. Climate change, inequality, the technological changes that are washing over our communities, disrupting communities. So I suppose what I'm interested in focusing on is how we might respond to that. What's the positive thing? And I think that we need to deconstruct the way in which governments make decisions. If we're stuck on those big public policy decisions, how do we make decisions? And we know that the shouty, sort of polarised sort of processes we have in Parliament aren't much good for that. So that's why we've explored in South Australia this idea of more deliberative forms of democracy. The first question we asked ourselves, though, was what is the process of making a decision? And I think there's some really useful thinking about, well, first you've got to raise awareness. You've got to get where people are about. I mean, we're very good at politicians in answering questions that people haven't asked. First, we've got to raise awareness about the very problem so that you can actually get permission to address it. Then you need to tap into the greatest resource we've got, which is the common sense judgment of ordinary everyday citizens, but do it in a way where you create a space for it, where you don't get shouting, you get deliberate dialogue. So you need civility first. So we've got to stop being angry and shouting at one another. We've got to be respectful of different points of view. I see this, the critique of the populist, Donald Trump. We all want to, I mean, he appalls me as well, but I think it's deeply unhelpful for us to be slagging him off in a way which makes him and his supporters just retreat into a different corner. It's the complete opposite of being able to reach a dialogue on these questions. And the one advantage of these citizens' assemblies that we've been promoting is that something really amazing happens when citizens get together in a small group. First, they have to look at each other in the eyes, and that immediately changes the nature of the debate. It civilises the debate. Secondly, it's very hard to hold on to a bigoted position. It's very hard to, in the face of a reasoned judgment, to hold on to your position that where you've lost the argument. It tends to lead to resolution and convergence. The other thing that happens is that it recalibrates the relationship between the expert and the citizen. Citizens' juries they are in control of the mechanism by which people then come in. So you can actually get an expert to come in at the request of the citizen. And they're then seen as servants of the judgment of citizens rather than somebody that comes in with the debate. And my shorthand sort of, which is hopelessly simplistic, but I think essentially Trump and Brexit is a product of the massive consensus that existed amongst really most of the mainstream parties about how wonderful globalisation was, and the victims of globalisation had to look for a voice somewhere, and somebody stood up and said, I'm on your team, and wonder of wonders, everybody voted for him.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Now, can I call on the student du jour to give us a judgment?
Hi, I'm Marco Roccato here with the Global Liberal Arts Alliance. I'm originally from Italy, so I definitely see traditional parties being all over the place and new and wonderful populist parties coming up every other day. So I had a question specifically for Mr. Papandreou, because especially parties on the left or center left in Europe have kind of forgotten how to talk to working class people and to those that are at the bottom of the social ladder. And we've seen populist and Eurosceptic and just nationalist parties kind of talking to that electorate and stealing that away from the left. So how do we keep our mainstream traditional left of center parties accountable and engaged with their electorate? Thank you.
I will agree with Jay, Mr. Weatherill, that the response of many to the problems of globalization, people feeling that they've been, the system isn't working for them. And it's true. People have been marginalized. There's huge inequality. Much of the response is, okay, we're desperate. We want somebody who's anti-systemic. We want somebody to throw, as Michael Moore said, throw a Molotov cocktail into the voting booth. And that's what came out of the elections, Trump or Brexit or whatever. It is a reaction. It's basically surrogate to saying, I'm giving up power to some authoritarian figure, but that person, usually a he, is going to, fight for me and destroy all these terrible things that are happening. But it's a dead end. I think we have to do the reverse. What was said earlier, new forms of democracy, new forms of citizen participation. And we should go back a little bit to the ancient Greeks. Representative democracy is one form, but that wasn't exactly how the ancient Greeks saw it. They used the ballot, what do you call it, deliberative polls or deliberative fora, which were chosen by lottery, where citizens were equal. Much more deliberation, where everybody had an equal voice. Of course, women and slaves were not there, but as a principle, citizens had equal voice. That principle, I think we need to bring back. First of all, to make sure that our citizens feel they do have a voice. Secondly, yes, I think many of the social democrats over the years bought into this market-based that everything is going to be solved in a good globalization and so on. And they or we were wrong. We really had to fight, and we have to go back to some of these principles that capitalism, as it is working today, is not serving public good. Social democracy has been able to humanize capitalism in the past. What we need to do possibly now is how do we humanize globalization to make sure that people's social welfare, people's voice, the environment, that these issues are top on our agenda. Fighting inequality, absolutely important. The question is, of course, we can't do that always simply at the local or national level. We need more cooperation. This is where Europe could play an important role. When Europe does stand up together, whether it's on digital issues, I think the commissioner before was talking about that, about the fight for digital justice and tax havens and so on. When Europe does stand up, it does have a voice. I think we have more power than we understand. That's why I think, of course, Brexit is a dead end to really solving our problems. We need more cooperation rather than isolating ourselves into our little islands. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, you have a question there. I just wanted to note, when we talk about this Athenian process of choosing their civil servants, they chose them by lot because they feared that voting for them would corrupt the process and make them make false promises. So they thought choosing them by lot was more equitable. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much for such an interesting panel. I'm Artemis Seaford with the Atlantic Council and also Stanford University. So I would like to ask you to comment on how we can help address two pathologies of party systems that perhaps can be described under the name of capture. So in the first case of capture, the party system captures spaces outside of it illegitimately. For example, in Greece, even in my generation growing up, the parties were notorious in schools, particularly universities, as sometimes leveraging inappropriately forms of power. So professors, for example, were known to hand out better grades to students that were affiliated with the same party, and so on. The second problem of capture is the opposite, when sources outside of parties inappropriately capture the parties themselves. And perhaps the most obvious example of this today is the capture of the Republican Party by our current president. So how can parties remain open, meritocratic, and robust to these two problems of capture?
Thank you. Angie, Jake, would one of you like to?
Oh, that's a big one. Well, I think any party that wants to change the world, if you don't want to change anything, I suppose you don't need an enormous amount of confidence in you. But if you're a party of social reform, you have to be a moral exemplar. That goes with the territory. If you want to tell people how to live their lives, if you want to redistribute income, if you want to engage in essentially these forms of change, you really do have to have your own act in order. So that means robust democratic processes within your own party. It means promoting legislative reform, which is anti-corruption type reforms, which apply to your party, campaign finance reform, donation reform. These are all part of a modern, clean system of government. It's very hard to go to the people and ask for them to put their confidence in you if you haven't got your own house in order.
Yeah. Well, thank you. We're technically out of time. Let me give Angie.
Oh, yeah, sure, of course. Yeah,
seriously out of time, and so I'd like to give our philosopher a quick last word here.
I work with a number of charities involved in philosophy in schools, and I think there's a lot we can do in primary as well as secondary schools to educate citizens who are more engaged in the democratic process and more able to spot the different kinds of capture that you alert us to and be more resilient to it. I've been dismayed how in the last 30, 40 years there has, again in the UK, there's been this huge decline in not just in philosophy in schools but in just basic citizenship lessons. So people are not alert to the dangers and of infiltrators taking over parties.
5 seconds.
5 seconds. I think we need to get money out of politics. That's one thing for getting, and of course we need institutions that check power. This is one thing that happens is sometimes, as our philosopher said, Angie said earlier, there are people or parties that maybe manipulate the system in order to stay in power. How do we check that power? So institutions such as transparency, like I brought in the avia, we say in Greek, but it's a transparency to bring all finances on the web, to bring in citizens' participation, actually bring in more participation, and our education system, as you said, should not simply be getting a profession. It should be teaching us to be citizens, critical citizens, and part of the education, as in ancient Greece, is not going only to school, but participating in public activities. Participation was education, and it takes time. We need more time for politics, and we need to bring this back into politics if we want politics again to really be what it was, is to reimagine a better world than simply looking at polls and funding. Really reimagining a better future for our society. That takes all of us to take on responsibility.
There you go. It does take more time, but it's better to run out of time than to run out of things to say. So thank you all, and now prepare for fireworks.